Imposter syndrome is one of those really interesting things which a lot of people tend to experience, especially as developers. Now, I stuck up a question on the channel recently, and 82% of people said they had experienced this, and the remaining 18% said they didn't know what it is. No one voted for no, they haven't experienced it. And the picture is the same elsewhere as well. There was a recent survey by Blind which said that 58% of people had experienced this. And in the same article, it goes back to 2011, which is a bit further back, obviously, but that argued that 70% of people had also experienced it as well. So imposter syndrome is clearly one of those things which a lot of people have experienced, but it's one of those things that is quite tricky to pinpoint what it actually is. So in this video, I want to outline briefly what it is from like a big point of view. I want to go into a few ways you can identify it. I also want to touch on some work by Dr. Valerie Young, which identifies 5 types of imposter syndrome, which is quite cool. And then we'll wrap up with a few ways which are nice and practical and ways which you can try and tackle imposter syndrome. Now, the whole point of this, I don't just want to be ranting and saying, here's everything. I quite like the idea of having this as like an open discussion. So, for example, in the previous video on slow productivity, lots of people commented with ways upon which they thought the book applied to them and gave their own kind of tips, tricks, advice, and experience. I tried to reply to every single one of them, and it was really helpful and really cool to see everyone's ideas and thoughts. So if you think you've experienced this before, or you've got your own ways of handling this, feel free to add a comment. I'll reply to everything. It'd be really cool to see what everyone else's thoughts are on the matter. So let's keep the intro really brief. The idea of imposter syndrome in a nutshell is the idea that you think you're a fraud and you kind of doubt your own accomplishments, despite the fact that there's evidence for you doing those things in the first place. And then you might put these achievements down to just luck, timing, or other external factors, and you're kind of negating the fact that this hard work was done by me, I deserve the credit. You kind of do the work and say, actually, it was down to luck, or I was helped by this person, or there were these other external factors here which made me do this work. It wasn't me who did it. And it can be quite anxiety inducing, so especially if you're working as a part of a team, you might feel like that you're not really part of that team. You're writing code, the code is going up and doing cool stuff, but it's just these other things around you that are helping you do the code. It's not really your talent or your skill, it's something else. Of course, that's a very loose definition. If you have one that you think is a bit better, feel free to comment and let me know. But generally, experiencing this can lead to feelings of inadequacy, anxiety, and the idea that someday you might be exposed as this fake person writing all this code, which sounds kind of funny, but yeah, can be very serious for a lot of people. So in my view, there are generally 5 ways you can identify as having imposter syndrome. The first one is just self-doubt. So this is where you might question your own abilities as a programmer and kind of question the things that you can do. The second one is your attribution of success. So suppose you've done a project, people are happy with it, you've got happy stakeholders, you might, rather than saying, okay, that was good, people are happy, I've done code, you might say to yourself something like, actually, the code was written, but I had all this help, I used these sources, most of it was down to luck, and I used ChatGPT. So rather than giving yourself the credit for all of that hard work you've done, you've kind of taken that credit and kind of given it off to all these other places instead, rather than you feeling happy and proud for the work you've actually done. Number 3, I suppose, is called fear of exposure. And this is the idea that somehow you might get outed by your peers as not being as good as you actually are, which I imagine if you did experience that will be pretty anxiety inducing. Number 4 is perfectionism, and this is where you're just setting extremely and often unachievably high standards for yourself as a programmer. And number 5 is overworking. So again, I suppose this links back to a previous video where we talked about burnout. You might be experiencing burnout because you're working so hard to try and avoid being outed as an imposter in your code. So those are just 5 simple ways, in my view, I think you can identify as having imposter syndrome. Of course, yeah, with that just being 5, there's probably a whole lot more. If you can think of any yourself, feel free to let me know. It'd be cool to see what you guys think. There's a book called The Secret Thoughts of Successful Women by Dr. Valerie Young. In the book, she identifies 5 imposter archetypes, and these are basically groups which you can fit in as an imposter. So let's go through them, and it might be interesting to see whether you think you fit into any of these groups. It might just be one, might be all, might be a few, might be none. So the first one is the perfectionist, and this will be someone who has anxiety over how things are done. The second one is the expert, and this will be someone who they fear has a lack of knowledge in a given area. Number 3 is the soloist, and this is someone who feels they have pressure to handle things all by themselves. Number 4 is the natural actual genius. And this is someone who has a fear of like not getting things 100% correct on the first try. The last one is the superhuman. And this will be someone who feels guilty if their work doesn't please everyone involved in the group. Of course, I've just brushed over those. I'm going to link down to the article below, so if you want to kind of go through and have a read about those different archetypes in more detail, yeah, feel free to do so. I think it's a really interesting read, especially if you're feeling like you're struggling with imposter syndrome. Now, onto the good stuff. These are different ways upon which I think you can tackle it. I've done a fair bit of research on this, and in general, most of the kind of articles and papers roughly suggest the same thing, just kind of reframed in different ways. I just want to kind of cover a couple and see what you guys think. And of course, if you have your own ways upon which you think this can be tackled, feel free to share. I'd be really keen to read and engage and reply with that discussion. The first one I think is really interesting is keeping a success journal. I normally try and journal every day. I'm not the best at it. I have like a little book I keep somewhere over there, and I try and just kind of write down a rough couple of thoughts each day. Now, the idea of a success journal is that suppose you've written some code, it's gone off to some stakeholders and they're really happy. You might just write about your actual contributions to what you've done, and then just use that as a way to kind of go back and reflect on later. So say, for example, you've written a project, it's gone off, people are happy. You might be thinking, oh, actually, part of it was down to luck. Maybe I was helped here. That's the imposter syndrome kicking in about your work. Actually, why don't you write down, to be honest, I wrote these classes, these methods, I wrote these tests, I wrote this documentation. This is all stuff that contributed to this project. Write down all the stuff that you've done, and then away from the context of your office or computer, read back on that later, whether that's like on the way home from the office, or it could be, a month down the line. This is a nice way to kind of go back and say, actually, this is physical stuff that I did and contributed. And then suppose you have those feelings come back in, you could open the journal, and then, maybe after 6 months to a year, whatever, you've got a really big log of things that you've actually gone and achieved. I think this is a really nice, clear, simple way to try and combat imposter syndrome. Number 2 is celebrating successes. So I'm not too sure how everyone works. Some people work in kind of like a 2-week sprint cycle or whatever. Suppose you've just done a sprint cycle, you've delivered a project. A really kind of good way to combat this is, rather than kind of just going from sprint to sprint, try and find literally, because this could be 5 minutes, it could be 10 minutes, whatever. Try and find some time just to celebrate your success, whether that's just sitting there quietly and thinking, okay, without the stuff I've written, this project might not have made it to the finish line. Without this tests, documentation, classes, methods, whatever, this project wouldn't have gone ahead and been finished without the stuff that I've actually gone and done. So this is a really simple one. After just doing some work that has made a difference, just take 5 minutes, have a think of what I've done. Maybe go back through the code you've written or the merge requests or whatever, and just have a little read through it and think, I've done this. This is good. Even if you did get help, that's fine. It's still your code. Even the most experienced developers still get help from ChatGPT or Stack Overflow. I've been coding for way over 10 years now. I still use it on a pretty regular basis. Lots of senior developers do. There's no shame in it. So just going back for the code you've written, even if you had help, just celebrate what you've done, celebrate the impact that this has had on other people. Especially if you've got a client who said, here's something I want to be designed and implemented. If you've been able to take that vision, turn that into code and deliver it, that is such a massive reason for celebrating what you've done. Number 3, I think is really nice, is just try and share these thoughts with other team members, especially given that such a high percentage of people have experienced this. The chances are that you could speak to someone else in your team, maybe another developer, it could be a junior or a senior or whatever, and they might have experienced exactly the same thing. So just having that connection to someone else in the team who's experienced the same thing is really helpful. If you struggle with this all by yourself, it just makes things a whole lot worse. I think that's the same with any kind of mental issues. If you keep it all into yourself, it just makes it worse. Having some kind of community or mentor you can go to and say, hey, I've done this project. I feel like I was a bit of a fraud because I got help from all these people and I had to use this. I feel pretty crap about it. They might say the same thing and say, actually, a few years ago I had the same thing. Here's kind of what I've done now and here's how I feel now. Just having that connection to, okay, I'm not alone. Someone else had the same problem as me. That can be really helpful. So my third one is definitely try and find someone who's experienced the same thing, see what they've done. And even if you don't get a solution from them, just saying, here's how I feel, and they can say, got it, I kind of felt the same way as well. That can be really helpful. The last one, which I think is probably the most difficult, and this kind of comes from the realm of CBT, the whole cognitive behavioral therapy stuff, which is really cool, is trying to reframe negative thoughts you have about your own work as a developer. Now, the reason I say this is harder is because you have to actually catch the negative thoughts happening and address them as they happen. So let's just take an example. You're starting on a project, you have to work with a new module you've never worked with before, you're struggling, you've gone off to get help, and straight away you're thinking, oh crap, I'm not experienced for this. This is not good. And then all the imposter stuff comes in, and there you go, you're back in that cycle. What you could do instead is, rather than thinking, oh God, this is not very good, is just take a second and think, well, actually, quite a lot of other senior devs, or other devs in general, they often work with libraries that are brand new for the first time. They must do the same thing. You can't be born knowing every single library. So as soon as that negative thought comes in, kind of catch it, reframe it, actually look at the facts about what you're doing. So, you're a programmer who is dealing with a new module. You've got the skills to go out and learn about it and then do it. That's really impressive. So maybe kind of write it out in that sense instead. You're not going out to find help because you suck at code. You're learning something brand new in the world of coding. You don't know how to do this specific thing. You have the skills to go off, get it, apply it, and do it. Write that down kind of as you're doing it, and I think catching the negative thoughts gives you a chance to reframe them. And I think, this won't heal it overnight, but I think kind of catching the negative thoughts, dealing with it there and then, is really helpful for the future and kind of starting you off on that journey to overcoming imposter syndrome. I think the tricky part about this is actually noticing it in the first place. It might be like a subconscious thing, and you kind of feel this dread of like, oh crap, I've gone to look on Stack Overflow again. So it might help for this is make sure that you know kind of what the symptoms of your own imposter syndrome are. So whether it's, I feel guilty because I'm looking at ChatGPT or these sources, make sure you kind of have them dialed in first before you try the step. I get it, this one's a bit more abstract and probably harder because you have to kind of keep a notepad with you all the time. But we're keen to see if this has worked for anyone else, or if you have a better idea as to how to kind of capture these negative thoughts as they happen, address them, reframe them, and try and move on. That's the end of the video, guys. So of course, I'm really keen to hear about other people's experience with this. I think it is one of those areas that is more abstract. Kind of researching this, a lot of the stuff is kind of wishy-washy. So if you've got your own experiences or your own kind of journey of imposter syndrome, feel free to share it in the comments. I'll, of course, read it, reply to it, engage with it. Cheers for watching, guys, and I'll see you all in the next video.